When did the two-party system begin in America? Which founding father seemed to foretell the future and warn us about the dangers of a country divided? What side of history was each party really on when it came to slavery? Join Edge of Wonder as we travel back in time to the beginning of the American nation and reveal the true origins of the present-day political system. Democrats versus Republicans, Part 1, the Party of Racism.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Edge of Wonder. We're your hosts. I'm Rob.
And I'm Ben. Today we want to shed light on our country's political parties.
We want to go back in history and look at how they came to be and what purpose they seem to serve.
Now, there's a lot of confusion about what each party seemed to stand for in the past and what they stand for today.
One party seemed to have been founded on American values and human rights, while the other seems to be rooted in racist origins and has kept those values to this day.
But which is which? So let's explore, shall we?
I hope so.
Yeah, me too.
America, the land of the racists?
As long as we ignore our history, we'll continue to make mistakes. This episode will be spent looking at the past to explore the foundations of America, but more specifically, our political parties.
There seems to be a common myth that America was founded upon racism and slavery.
This just doesn't seem to be true though. So let's dive in and set the record straight.
The argument that America was founded on slavery is usually used to justify the current issues we are facing now. It's important to understand that.
Yes, and we're not taking sides here, but to use this argument to justify the destruction of America without actually knowing the real history of our country is just a recipe for disaster.
As we pointed out in our human trafficking series, slavery goes back to ancient times. So by the time America was founded, slavery couldn't go away just like that.
America did tolerate the common practice of slavery at the beginning. I mean, many founding members of this country owned slaves themselves.
Now keep in mind, slavery had been so ingrained into human culture at the time that it was unfortunately normal to own slaves. And when you are born into a slave-owning family and are brought up around that, you might not realize how wrong it really is as a young person. Now, we're not making excuses for those people, we're simply stating how culture was at the time, and you have to understand that in order to understand the history of us undoing racism in this country.
However, when America began to become established as its own country after the Revolutionary War, many founding members sought to phase slavery out as quickly as possible. George Washington eventually even said that any slave who served the Continental Army would be freed.
And the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware shows an African American next to Washington. But freeing the slaves completely would obviously be no easy task. Many wanted to keep slavery in place and would stop at nothing to repress those who wanted it abolished.
It's said that when the debate over the Declaration of Independence's contents took place, Thomas Jefferson tried to include a provision that would have condemned King George III for, quote, waging cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither.
We should just start using hither again. I mean, really. That was a very important paragraph, but I mean, hither.
Yeah.
But anyway, it seems that southern states demanded that this provision of Jefferson's be removed. So Jefferson then supposedly removed the clause about slavery.
So in 1777, Vermont actually became the first sovereign state to abolish slavery. And as we know, northern states continued to fight for the abolition of slavery in America.
It's said that the Democrat Party was created as far back as the 1790s by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison.
This was basically known as the first party system, which was made up of two original parties: the Federalist Party, which would become the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Republican Party, which would then become the Whig Party, and then eventually the Republican Party as we know today.
George Washington had warned about the dangers of the rise of political parties, though. In his farewell address given in 1796, he said, quote, "However political parties may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion," unquote.
He also warned about being careful when conducting business with foreign nations to have as few political connections as possible. It was almost as if he knew countries such as China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and so many more of them would be able to influence politicians here in the US in the future.
So Washington recognized the party system could eventually divide the country and even warned everyone about it. But as we all know, no one listened, so the first party system was characterized as a system based on differential participant politics. Both parties basically went along with the policies put forward by elite political leaders out of either respect for the leader's family, military accomplishments, prosperity, or education. With this ideology, political leaders of the first party system could be looked at as an early American aristocracy.
However, this first party system started to dissolve in the early 1800s, and in 1816 the Federalist Party had died out, which left just one party, the Anti-Federalist or Democratic Republican Party. But this only lasted a short while.
Then a split happened in the Democratic Republican Party, which gave rise to the National Republicans and the Democrats.
Andrew Jackson had lost the election in 1824, which led to his supporters creating an organization of their own to try to get him elected 4 years later.
And that is exactly what happened. Jackson won the election of 1828 in a landslide victory, and that organization became the Democrat Party.
It's believed that Andrew Jackson was known as a ruthless slave owner. This newly formed version of the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson believed that slavery was a necessary part of economic progress. They also seemed to think that it was justified morally.
In 1830, just about 2 years into Jackson's term, he signed the Indian Removal Act. This was a law that enabled Jackson to negotiate with tribes located in southern states to be moved west.
This became known as the Trail of Tears, which led to many Native American deaths while walking the trail west. And this was all done to make room for white settlers in the South.
Jackson had fought in the War of 1812 against the Creek Indians. Perhaps he developed a hatred for Native American tribes and wanted to push them as far away as possible. And it seems that Andrew Jackson and his newly founded Democrat Party's ideology would have a lasting effect.
The Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854 was put in place by Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas.
This act would enable the Nebraska and Kansas territories to have slaves on the land.
However, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had prohibited this from happening. Douglas wanted to see the place now known as Nebraska become a territory.
And also to gain support from the South. So he proposed the Kansas Nebraska Act. The Missouri Compromise would have to be repealed for this act to pass.
Then, in May of 1854, the bill was passed to repeal the Missouri Compromise. This ended up splitting the Whig Party.
Almost every Northern Whig member opposed the bill, and almost every Southern Whig voted to pass the bill. This had a massive effect on America.
This act was put into effect by Democratic President Franklin Pierce, who saw the abolitionist movement as a threat to the country.
Franklin Pierce is probably best known for two things. One, signing the Kansas Nebraska Act bill, and two, enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically made it possible for any slave who escaped to be recognized as a fugitive. And upon their arrest, they would be handed over to the authorities.
Yeah, the Kansas Nebraska Act could be considered the most significant event to spark the Civil War. The Northern Whig members, who had been trying to slowly phase slavery out of America for many years, couldn't just let something like the Missouri Compromise to be taken away so easily.
Right. They had made good progress so far, and this was just a slippery slope to letting the Southern Whig Party members and the Southern Democrats have slavery placed back into American practice everywhere.
In the same year as the Kansas Nebraska Act 1854, the Republican Party was founded. It seems that the Kansas Nebraska Act was such a significant event that something needed to be done to prevent slavery from occurring in America.
The Republican Party was actually founded by opponents of the Kansas Nebraska Act, the Slavery Act.
Yes, this newly founded Republican Party went full force into their mission to abolish slavery. Its supporters argued that the Republic was under threat from the power that slavery presented.
Southern slave owners who wanted to keep slavery in place demanded more protection to keep their human property.
Yeah. And in 1858, Abraham Lincoln gave one of his most famous speeches in Springfield, Illinois, called the House Divided Speech, after he accepted the Illinois Senate seat.
Quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south."
Lincoln made this speech as a warning that America was in danger of becoming an entirely slave-based nation, and that if the North did not do something, then that is exactly what would happen. This speech was basically a call to arms.
Abraham Lincoln would win the presidential election of 1860 to become the 16th president of the United States. This mission to abolish slavery was starting to pick up speed.
The American Civil War kicked off in April 1861 after Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard attacked Fort Sumter, South Carolina. This happened just a month after Abraham Lincoln had been inaugurated as President of the United States.
In response to the attack, President Lincoln called for volunteers to fight back against the rebel army.
The North responded quickly. However, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas refused to fight with the Union and instead joined the Confederacy.
Union troops marched south to take the Confederate capital of Richmond, but were defeated.
The Union Army would continue to lose battles. They were forced to retreat after the 7 Days Battles, which gave rise to the famous Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Now, Lee was able to drive the Northern forces back, gaining a ton of momentum for the Confederate Army.
Enter General Ulysses Grant. Grant was able to take Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. He was also able to defeat the Confederate Army in Tennessee.
The real turning point, though, seemed to be in Gettysburg and Vicksburg. In 1863, Grant moved north towards Pennsylvania.
After 3 days of fighting in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, General Lee was defeated. Then Grant's siege of Vicksburg opened the Mississippi River up to shipping. This seemed to be the beginning of the end for the Confederacy.
Grant would go on to win more critical battles at Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, which ultimately led to the surrender of the Confederate Army.
In July 1862, there was the Second Confiscation and Militia Act, which was the first step towards enlisting African Americans in the Union Army.
This actually gave rise to several African American infantry units, including the famous 54th Massachusetts.
On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the Confederate States. It also officially allowed the Union to recruit African American troops.
And in February 1863, Massachusetts Governor John A. Andrew officially issued the Civil War's first call for black soldiers. About 1,000 black men answered the call, many of whom were not even from Massachusetts.
I mean, why not fight for your freedom?
Yeah, exactly.
It's awesome. Many came from slave states, and some were said to have come from Canada and as far as the Caribbean. A young colonel named Robert Shaw was chosen to lead these men.
Unfortunately, nearly half of the 600 men of the 54th Massachusetts were killed, including Colonel Shaw, when they stormed Fort Wagner. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but stormed the fort anyway.
This infantry unit has gone down as one of the most inspiring and bravest units in military history. There was actually a movie made in the 80s about this called Glory, which is actually a really awesome movie.
After the American Civil War ended, the Negro Republican Party was formed during a time called the Reconstruction Era, which lasted from 1863 to 1877. This was a time that called for reconstruction after years of war. And it was also a time that gave freed slaves civil rights guaranteed by several new constitutional amendments.
People sought to transform the 11 Southern Confederate states and accept this new direction Lincoln was trying to take America in.
When Republican President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated following the Civil War, Vice President Andrew Johnson took over as president. Johnson, who was a Democrat and believer in the ideals of the Confederate South, sought to undo what Lincoln had achieved. And by the way, this was also the beginnings of what we now know as the shadow government coming into power in the US.
Boom! That was probably the craziest thing we've said all episode.
I think so.
Andrew Johnson wanted to bring Southern radical ideas back into the Union, allowing Southern states to determine the rights for former slaves.
Lincoln, evidenced by the speeches he gave before he was killed, showed that he supported African American rights. Johnson seemed to have strongly opposed Lincoln's efforts to impose more rights for freed slaves.
Republicans during the Reconstruction Era were actually referred to as the Radical Republicans by the Democrats of the time. That sounds familiar.
Seriously.
Radical right? I mean, where have we heard that before? That was because of everything they were doing to give freed slaves more rights.
The 14th Amendment, which was known as one of the Reconstruction Amendments, was put in place to address the rights of freed slaves.
This, of course, was fought by Johnson and his Democratic administration's deep roots in Southern ideology.
Democratic deep roots,
Yeah. The election of 1866 actually gave Republicans the majority in Congress, though, which enabled them to pass the 14th Amendment.
However, riots soon followed, including the Memphis riots and the New Orleans massacre in 1866. These were two racially motivated events that followed both the Civil War and all of the progress made in giving freed slaves more and more rights.
So the riots were literally against giving people more rights.
Yes.
Which is actually like, it doesn't seem like it, but that's actually what's going on right now.
It is, actually.
Yeah.
And it's all spearheaded still by the Democratic Party. It's just whatever fits their agenda,
Oh my
it seems
gosh.
like, right? I mean,
Okay, in
Anyway.
1868, the Civil War general Ulysses S Grant was elected president. Grant, a Republican president, strongly supported the ideals of the Reconstruction Era.
Grant passed what was called the Enforcement Acts, which protected former slaves' rights, like the right to vote or hold political office. Grant used the Enforcement Acts to combat the Ku Klux Klan.
The Ku Klux Klan emerged during the Reconstruction Era to overthrow the Republican states. Okay, does everybody hear that? Let me just say it again. Go back up. I'm going to say this again for you all. The Ku Klux Klan emerged during the Reconstruction Era to overthrow the Republican states. Many believe that the KKK was actually an arm of the Democratic Party, designed to intimidate black people into staying out of politics and also to intimidate Republican politicians who supported giving freed slave rights. Did everybody hear that?
The KKK also seemed to exist to help the Democrats of the time win elections through violence and intimidation. I think we're all pretty familiar with the KKK and how violent and racist they have always been.
Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest served as the Ku Klux Klan's first Grand Wizard. He was also honored for this at the 1868 Democratic National Convention.
The slogan for this convention was reportedly, quote, "This is a white man's country. Let white men rule."
Okay.
Yeah,
The
seriously.
KKK was said to have put forth a battle plan stating, quote, "Every Democrat must feel honor bound to control the vote of at least one Negro by intimidation. Democrats must go in as large numbers and well armed," unquote.
Well armed. Then, in that same year, there was an issue of Harper's Weekly with an illustration of two white Democrats standing next to a black man pointing a gun at him. At the bottom of the illustration was a caption that read, quote, "Of course he wants to vote the Democratic ticket."
In 1876, Democrats took control of Congress and did many things to try and stop black people from voting. Things like requiring literacy tests to vote. Remember, these people were slaves and weren't allowed to be educated. Requiring them to pass a literacy test seemed a bit unnecessary and kind of nuts.
Yeah, seriously. They also apparently redrew election lines, changed polling locations, and even created whites-only primaries.
The Ku Klux Klan was extremely violent and played a huge role in helping Democratic politicians suppress black people from progressing in society by using violence, fear, and intimidation to achieve their goals.
There seems to be a common myth within American history, the belief that the Republican Party swapped places with the Democratic Party to become the party of racism. This doesn't seem to be true, though.
No. According to the Daily Wire's list of 11 common myths of American history, quote, "One of the favorite refrains of the Democratic Party, attempting to escape its history of racism, slavery, and segregation, is that in the 1960s, the Republican Party hijacked racism and the Democratic Party abandoned it," unquote.
Then they went on to point out that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the turning point for the Democratic Party in escaping its racist roots.
Many Democrats claim that the Democratic South slowly moved into the Republican ideology and the Republican North turned more Democratic over time, so the parties swapped.
According to the Daily Wire, Democrats believe that this was clearly the result of racism coming into the forefront of the GOP. This also does not seem to be true.
At all. The Daily Wire pointed out that it was Southern Democrats that fought against the Civil Rights Movement, much like what had been happening since the Reconstruction Era. Quote, "In 1948 and 1968, insurgent Democrats launched anti-civil rights presidential campaigns. Civil rights bills required more Republican than Democratic support," unquote.
Basically, they were just better at marketing. They knew how to market themselves. There's also the myth that suggests that some Southerners vote Republican because they believe the Republican Party is the racist party. There doesn't seem to be any evidence to support this, though. According to Gallup.com, survey on race relations, quote, "Southern Americans' ratings of race relations are currently about average when compared with those in other parts of the country."
And according to the Daily Wire, quote, "The most segregated areas of the South are in major metropolitan areas, which tend to vote more heavily Democratic than their surrounding areas," unquote. The Democratic Party's roots seem to be in racism, but it didn't stop after the Reconstruction Era.
And as we just mentioned, their racist roots seem to reach to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, but did it go even further than that?
Could it be that the Democratic Party has always been a threat to people of color? Could it be that the leaders are pushing some kind of agenda? But what exactly is that agenda, and why?
And join us next time as we continue to travel through the timetable of American culture regarding our political parties.
So until next time, we'll see you out
on the edge.
Origins of the Democratic Party. Origins of the Democratic Party.
I was just gonna say that. Oh man.
It said that the Democratic Party. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, ready? Mm-hmm. Singing the Kansas Nebraska Act bill.
Signing. That'd be hilarious.
Okay, go back up.
That's definitely for the bloopers right there. Just picture him in the thing, like
he's at a podium and he's just belting.
Oh man, okay.